Thank you. Welcome this afternoon. These are some hard times, and there are hard things that people are facing. So we're pleased that you were able to join us this afternoon for this month's third Thursday Conversations with Brite faculty that will be led by Dr. Joretta Marshall. My name is Eileen Thelig, and I direct the lay and continuing education program here at Brite, and wanted to just welcome you, let you know who is here to help kind of manage the session this afternoon. I'm here, Lauren Baxter, who is our Director of Instructional Services, our IT, and Holly Neal, who is my Administrative Assistant. We will be helping if there are issues in the chat. We will be responding to those, or you can send us a message or not. I also wanted to just reiterate that we are recording the session, so it'll be available later. If you have a concern about privacy, feel free to rename yourself or submit any questions via the chat, and we will try to pass those along as part of the conversation. With that, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Joretta Marshall.
Thank you, Eileen and Holly and Lauren, who are all back screen, if you will, trying to manage our conversation today. I appreciate all of you showing up. This is a time when it's both important to show up and sometimes it's hard to show up. So resiliency. I am not necessarily an expert in resiliency, although I've read a lot about it. I've been working on issues of resiliency and perseverance and grit, particularly as it affects spiritual journeys and journeys related to hope and hopelessness, to despair and trying to find a way forward. There are a lot of resources that are now showing up in the literature, in the culture around us, about defining the words resiliency, defining what it is we think we mean. And I'd invite you in the chat to feel free to put your words in there. When you think of resiliency, what kind of words begin to show up in your imagination? When you think of perseverance, what kind of words begin to show up in your imagination? I'm going to share a couple of resources and definitions. Yeah. So these are definitions that are not in stone, but they're definitions that help us think about what it is we think we're thinking about when we talk about resiliency. First of all, resiliency is oftentimes defined as the ability to return after adversity or disappointment. To return is kind of an odd phrase. To return to what? And some people talk about the ability to bounce back, or the ability to kind of get back to what one was before an adversity happened. Pauline Boss, who's a psychologist and who's written a couple of books on ambiguous loss, uses resiliency to talk about how it is that we move forward in our lives when ambiguity and ambivalence are all around us. And in many ways, we live in a moment of deep ambiguous loss. We've lost our in-person worship, and yet I am impressed with the ways in which clergy and laity are showing up, doing worship in new and creative ways. Who knew the church could change so quickly? And who knew it would take so much energy and so much time and so much effort? But there's a kind of way in which there's a resiliency, the ability to say, we have adversity in front of us, and we need to move forward in some way. Some people talk about resiliency as the ability to live fully without giving in to despair or hopelessness or trauma or anger. It doesn't mean that you don't feel despair, and we'll talk about the importance of these feelings in just a minute, but that despair doesn't become the last word. So in resilient people or resilient families or resilient communities, they may experience despair, but it's also tempered with a sense that this is not the last word. This is a word on a journey, and it's okay, and we'll also figure out how to move forward. When COVID-19 first hit, I was struck with the number of commercials by corporations who focused on how we will get through this together. That's a kind of resilient spirit. And in some ways, resiliency pulls us forward or drags us along in the midst of adversity, in the midst of trying to figure out how to deal with some kind of stressor in life. So it's a very dynamic concept, resiliency. Perseverance is related to it. It's a little bit different. We persevere. We think about how it is that we want to keep on with someone. There's a steadfastness, a commitment to completing a task, of learning something new, a perseverance of figuring out how to work with Zoom and WebEx Connect and all of the other platforms that are out there. We persevere, we just keep on keeping on. And there's a certain resiliency to it. But oftentimes when I think about perseverance, I think about how difficult it is sometimes just to put one foot in front of another. And it's that perseverance of knowing that eventually I will put one foot in front of another again, and I will take a step, or I will make a move, or I will find a way to do something that has been challenging for me. Think about learning a skill or a hobby, learning how to preach, learning how to teach, learning how to do some kind of job. That takes perseverance, and it takes an ongoing kind of way of steadfastness, commitment to something. The last concept is grit, which I like a lot. It's probably because of my Midwestern heritage or something, but this notion of grit is another one that has been taken by particularly psychologists and people who do learning with children and adults. Professor Angela Duckworth, who's a psychologist, has written a book early on called Grit, and it's about how to help children ingrain themselves with a sense of grit, sustain interest and passion for long-term goals. Here's one of the quotes from the book from Angela Duckworth. They define grit as perseverance and passion for long-term goals. It entails working strenuously toward challenges, maintaining effort and interest over years despite failure, adversity, and plateaus. The gritty individual approaches achievement as a marathon. His or her advantage is stamina, whereas disappointment or boredom signals to others that it's time to change trajectory and cut losses. The gritty individual stays the course. So there's a little bit of perseverance, there's a little bit of resiliency, there's a little bit of just staying the course because one knows that that's the gritty thing to do. Now, I'm curious, as you look at these definitions, what begins to pop in your mind, or what kinds of questions show up? Get back to the screen here. What kinds of questions show up? And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about these words or how they work in your life. There's a way in which the life of faith, the life of spirit and soul, is really a life that ties into the way in which we face adversity, we move through it, and sometimes we move beyond it. In this moment, it feels to me that a lot of people, including myself, we are tired and worn out. I just am stunned at the number of pastors and churches and congregations, teachers who have faced the moment not knowing what the next moments bring, whether it's facing the challenge of COVID in your family, or facing the way in which racism impedes the wholeness of people, or facing the way in which churches have to move and navigate. It just takes an incredible amount of energy. And tiredness, weariness, is as much a part of that journey and should be honored, just like resiliency and grit and stamina, perseverance. Eileen, I'm wondering if there's anything that's showing up on the chat that would be helpful to.
Someone has asked how tenacity fits into all of this. And we tend to think it is most with perseverance, but it seems to fit in all three.
Okay, that sounded like Holly's voice. Holly is also here today working on this. How tenacity fits, that's a great word, because it does fit into this kind of notion that there's a way in which we face something, the way in which we stay with something, that it takes a tenacious person, or that personality piece, that characteristic in our personhood, to keep having hope when hope seems so far away, or to keep having resiliency when it would be just as easy to sit down and not get up again. Yeah. Nice. Anything else that's showing up? I see the question about how does one develop. I'm glad you asked how you develop or nurture tenacity, because that's exactly where we're headed next. So if you go to the internet, which is at this moment an incredibly connected gift, I would much rather sit down with a group of people and talk in person. But the internet and the way in which we have begun to share resources that are important to us should not be dismissed easily. The way in which we resource one another is part of how we nurture not just community, but how we nurture resiliency. So if you go to the internet and look up grit or perseverance or resiliency, but particularly resiliency, you'll see lists that people have developed about what you ought to be doing and how you can nurture that resiliency in your own spirit. And you'll notice that I use that little word ought. This is one of the challenges of talking about resiliency. This is not about you ought to be resilient. It's not about you ought to be tenacious and persistent and have grit. It is about how is it that God might be inviting us in this moment to tap into resources that move us toward greater wholeness, not just as individuals, but wholeness as a community. When I think about the anti-racism efforts in so very many communities, one of the things that I am so aware of is that we need one another in doing the work that we do. That good anti-racism work requires community, it requires deep listening, it requires persistence, it requires resiliency. And that we can find ways in which resiliency can nurture the hopefulness of changing the world, or changing at least a part of the world. So I want to name 5 things. And the 5 things are, again, not magic, they're just 5 things. Let me go back to share my screen again. I'm going to talk about these as strategies for the journey. The first strategy, I think, is staying realistic and imaginative at the same time. I notice my share didn't quite go there. There we go. Staying realistic and imaginative at the same time. This is not being stoic or having naive optimism or thinking that everything's going to be just fine in the next 24 hours. This is, how do we stay realistic and keep imagining new ways of retaining hope? So the first thing I want to name, and it's, I think one of our more challenging parts, is we have to be honest about how we're feeling, and we have to appreciate that we have feelings. This is perhaps one of the challenges for those of us in particularly the Judeo-Christian tradition, and especially those in kind of more Protestant mainline white congregations, for example. We know we have feelings, we just don't know where they are, and we don't like to express them very much, or we don't know how to express them, or we don't know what to do when somebody else expresses them. which is not a horrible thing or a bad thing. It's simply a challenge. But feelings are incredibly rich. They provide us insights and thoughts. They lead us to anger. They lead us to change. They lead us to transformation. Having feelings of anger in this moment, or having feelings of despair or tiredness or weariness, and we could debate whether those words are states of being or really emotions. At the moment, I just want to say we are a group of tired people, and we are also a hopeful group. Those two things can go together at the same time. One of the challenges in our culture is that we've gotten into thinking that you are either happy or sad. You are either full of hope or you lack hope. You are either someone who has resilience or you don't. And part of what's really true is that we have more than two feelings inside of us at any one moment in time. So at this moment, I might feel incredibly sad about the way in which our culture seems to be moving. And every now and then there's something that just gives me a little bit of hope, just a little bit of something. So recognizing our feelings and allowing them to inform our perspective is actually quite important. It helps, our feelings help us recognize what's meaningful in our life. Some of you who have been around Brite for a long time remember Andy Lester, perhaps. Andy was a gifted and talented and deeply faithful and committed human being who always was generous in the ways that he thought. One of his most profound books, I think, is actually his book on anger, in which he talks about anger as being a way in which we recognize what's important in our life, and that it helps us move forward to keep on looking for change, to keep on working for changes in the culture. So the feelings can help us recognize what's most meaningful and what's important. Alongside of that is recognizing small and imaginative signs of hope. I like miracles, and I think they happen once in a while. I think they happen once in a while. And I know that prayer changes things, and I know that perhaps some of us believe that prayer can even change God's mind about something. But mostly, I think that what's been most helpful for me from time to time is to recognize that I can see signs of hope, and those small signs of hope feed into the reservoir of hope that has been there for eons and generations. Let me see if I can explain what I mean by that. In our culture and in our world, when things are challenging, when we meet moments like this moment in our culture, we can't always find the great big signs of hope, but those small imaginative signs of hope become incredibly important for recognizing where God's Spirit is leading us and for recognizing what it is that we might be called to do in this moment. And the small signs of hope can become things like, I recognized the other day that a plant that I thought had certainly literally bitten the dust had a little bit of green showing up. It might be a small sign of hope that says, I recognize that in this moment, I'm less despairing than I was yesterday. Those are small signs of hope, and they feed into our deeper sense of hope. So being realistic and imaginative can be helpful in terms of thinking about resiliency. The second strategy is to think about the way in which the past can feed our present reality. Not just the negative pieces, but the positive pieces. How is it that resiliency has been nurtured in communities over time? So I think about sacred stories first. I think about the psalmist who laments and who at the end of the lament is able to say, and still, I believe in this kind of God who will be with me and who will show up for me. I think about sacred texts like the story of the Exodus, or for me in my New Testament stories, I think about the woman who was persistent. Those kind of images in our life and in our faith are reminders about resiliency. So part of the key is to think about this resiliency, to think about these people of faith, to think about the concrete people who lived lives of faith, and to recognize and name what kind of resilient spirits and behaviors helped them hang on. If we get through this in time, we'll listen to a song by Sweet Honey in the Rock. And if you don't know the group Sweet Honey in the Rock, look them up. YouTube is a gift. We'll think about a song that they have called I Remember, I Believe, in which they trace some of the ways in which this resilient spirit of the soul has continued to show up generation after generation after generation. So think about the people of faith, think about the stories of faith, and then be specific about what kinds of qualities, what kinds of people stood with them, what kinds of resistance did they have to survive in order to thrive once again. One of the things about resiliency is that the more specific you can get in thinking about a topic or a person or an experience, the more helpful it is to grab onto small pieces. I think, for example, about my grandmother who met some adversity as a young mother. She ended up being a single parent when her husband died, just as they were beginning to make a journey from Wisconsin to California. What I think about is the spirit that I suspect was in her being that allowed her to figure out how to take her two young children and move from Wisconsin to California at a time when it was pretty hard and that there were no resources for her. And once she got to California, she discovered that she needed to come back because my mother needed to grieve the father that she lost. So she picked her children back up and came back across the United States. Thinking about her specifically, I can see in her eye, we're going to do this, even though people think I'm crazy. I'm going to do this. I'm going to figure out how to make a living, even though there are no options, or at least it feels that way. So think about the specific qualities that you see in people. The other way to nurture this part of our life is to think about a situation. This is a kind of narrative way to think about a situation in your life when you met adversity, because every one of us has met adversity in some way. And try to remember in detail some of what that past experience was like. Where did you find strength and hope? What surprised you about your perseverance or your gift or your resiliency? Who was with you on the journey? I encourage people to write out these stories, to think them through, or to share them with a friend or a pastor or a spiritual director. Because reminding ourselves that we have come from somewhere to this moment can remind us about some of the strengths, some of the gifts, some of the resiliencies deep in our spirit that sometimes just get worn out and they have to be recovered in a particular kind of way. So this second strategy is to think about experiences of the past, both your own personal, but also the sacred stories of our faith that are so important in thinking about resiliency. The third strategy is action, agency. To be proactive and to think about how can you literally do something, and what does it mean to do something for yourself, for others, for the community. Almost all the literature on resiliency suggests that when someone does something, even if it's a very small thing, like they get up in the morning, that's not a small thing sometimes. It's agency. It's finding not just the inner strength, but the strength from the community around you sometimes to be able to act on your own behalf, to act on the behalf of the community. I've been struck with Dr. Fauci trying to remind us that being concerned about those around us is quite important. In some ways, we have lost that attitude in our culture, and agency, recovering it, means not just being concerned about myself, but concerned for those around me. So that wearing a mask is a small sign of agency, a small sign of resisting being simply a respondent at the moment, but actually doing something. Self-care is one of the ways in which we think about agency. For me, self-care is a theological commitment. It's a commitment to God and to myself and to my community that I want to bring my best self, that I want to retain the spirit of resiliency and generosity and courage and compassion and all of those kinds of words. And in order to do that, I have to really tend to my own self, tend to my own work around the isms of the day, tend to my own embeddedness in whiteness, tend to my own way in which I sometimes forget to go out and physically be active for a moment. These are small acts of self-care that actually require us to take action on our own behalf. The other way in which agency can show up is having rituals, creating rituals. Sometimes we use the rituals of our faith, like I have been much touched in the last several months by the ritual of communion at home with my partner. It's a small ritual that has incredible meaning. And it's not done in the traditional way where we gather as a worshiping community all in one place. And yet the meaningfulness of the ritual is still there. There are other kinds of small rituals like having a gratitude check-in every night with your family. Like, what is the one thing for which you are thankful? Or having a practice of looking for one piece of beauty outside in nature before it gets too hot in Texas. Getting up in the morning or staying up at night and seeing the one thing, naming a joy, naming a way in which life could be abundant in a moment. Those become important rituals as well, and a way to have agency. The fourth strategy seems self-evident, and yet me, it's really hard work. Retaining and nurturing and exercising our spirituality is sometimes hard work. And what we know is that if we don't pay attention to it, it can become stagnant. And when we are tired and overworked and weary and anxious and fearful, spirituality sometimes gets stomped on a little bit, and we have to find ways to nurture it again, to bring it back to life, to remember that we have a spirit and a soul. So there are three ways that I think this is important. One is to stay connected to the Holy One. So naming how you stay connected to the Holy One. Naming what kind of practice you do to connect yourself to the Holy One, whether it's reading the Bible or praying or reflecting together with a community in a Sunday school class on Zoom. How do you stay connected? And how can you practice that? This is the piece about spirituality. It's one thing to think about it. It's another to practice it, to enrich it, to let it have a life, to breathe life into it. How do you stay connected to your own soul? How do you practice connections to your soul? How do you stay connected to the community and those beyond you, to your family, to people that are important in your life? That's all part of your spirituality. And it's a way in which we can nurture the resiliency in us. And the last one is I find myself in this moment needing to be kinder to myself and to those around me than I sometimes am aware. In this moment, I keep thinking about how can I be gentle with myself and not judge myself for not being something or not doing something. This is an era, I think, when it's important to step back and to give people space, to give yourself space, to recognize that sometimes you're going to miss the mark. That doesn't mean you're a failure, just means you've missed the mark. And when I say be gentle with one another, it's not the same as not holding one another accountable. We can hold one another accountable and still be compassionate and still have a sense of humility and grace even as we do that. So thinking about how we give ourselves space, how we give others space. I've been reminded that it's easy for me to say, well, I'm going to exercise 4 times this week. And then when I realize that it's the end of the week and I did it twice, I have to do 2 things. I have to say, and I didn't do it 4 times, and maybe that's okay. And how could I change that for the next week, which is activating agency? How can I do it differently next week? Those are all part of the same movement toward resiliency. Okay, let me stop there and see what kinds of reflections, thoughts, questions, kind of chats we have going on. Eileen or Holly, I wonder if you have some thoughts about the chats.
I thought my space bar was working, but it's not. So one of the questions that was raised is that, and we recognize everyone's tiredness at this point, and that we're all dealing with a lot of these issues. And sometimes we stop from drawing on others because either we know they're dealing with a lot, or we feel like they've got more on their plate than we've got on ours. How do we kind of navigate that type of situation?
Yeah, great question. Great question. How do we turn to one another without expecting more than is realistic, and yet recognize that we need to stay in touch with each other? Is that it's kind of one of the ways I would say it. And I'd welcome those of you who heard the question to put in the chat some of the ways in which you think about this, because it's the way in which we stay in community, is by having conversation. So in our small family of 3 that lives in my house, we have a list of people that we want to stay in touch with intentionally. And we each kind of at the end of the week say, now, who did we stay in touch with, and who do we want to reach out to now? Because it's important that we kind of keep track of that in some way. I think if this, one of my hopes is that this moment will teach us how to live better into the future. And I think if we can be honest with one another, that teaches us something about how to live better into the future. So that if I'm exhausted and somebody calls me, I might say, is this urgent or can it wait till tomorrow? And if I can be that honest, then people have the option of saying, well, this is really urgent, or no, this can wait till tomorrow. That clarity of spirit, that humility and vulnerability of saying, I'm exhausted, that is as important, I think, as anything else. It's the honest part of our feelings, right? If I'm exhausted, what I know is that I'm more short-tempered, that I have less tolerance for things that are not perfect, which is a lot of the world at the moment. But if I'm rested, I can find a spirit of and a capacity of compassion that gets lost if I'm too tired. So reaching out to one another can be, for some people, a really gift-giving thing. For other people, it is spiritually draining to be in touch. If I were to ask you all how many Zooms you have been on in the last week and how you feel about them all, I suspect some of you would say, there are just way too many Zooms and chat rooms in the world, and I need a little space. Others, you would say, I really need to be connected, and it's the only way I stay connected. These are not rights and wrongs. These are ways of knowing yourself enough and respecting others to both stay connected and give space. We can do both at the same time, stay connected and give space. Wondering if others have thought of some ways to respond to that as well.
Well, we had a question come in while you were talking, and it said, how would you recommend fostering this in a congregation?
Fostering resiliency in a congregation? Number one, it's not up to the religious leader, right? A religious leader, a pastor, a congregational leader needs to find ways to stay resilient, her or himself or themselves. And by modeling it, other people sometimes see it and give witness to it. It also seems to me that this is a way to kind of nurture the spirit of resiliency, is a way to bring a congregation together in this time, to have a conversation about how's your spirit, to have a conversation about what are you celebrating these days and what are you grieving, because you can do both in the same conversation. When I was traveling a lot, I used to get a little bit angry at myself because I was away from home and I realized I was missing things. And I also realized I enjoyed what I was doing. I felt both ways. So we created a ritual at home so that when I came home, we would stop and say, well, what did we lose by this time of being apart? And what did we gain? What that did was add a richness to the kind of way in which we thought about my leave taking for a weekend or an overnight or a week. That kind of ritual is a kind of nurturing resiliency. So to think about that in congregational terms, how can we sit together and say, this is what we've lost and this is what we've gained in this last week? Or how can we sit together and focus on one of these pieces? Like to ask a congregation or a small group in a congregation to share what stories of resiliency from the sacred text do they find most reassuring? And what stories of resiliency from their own lives do they find most reassuring or most helpful to them? And what are they learning out of those stories? It seems to me that especially the conversation piece these days has to keep moving forward. I've also heard some really good sermons from pastors who are trying to intentionally invite people not just into hope, but into naming what's happening in the world around them. And sometimes the naming is really hard work, but naming it and giving witness to it can also be a way of nurturing some of that resiliency, to find ways to move forward.
I've got, and you were just talking about, there's a lot of what we've been talking about kind of has to do with people who have more family around them, as opposed to people living in isolation or living by themselves, and how to nurture those connections, I guess, or practices to help build one's own resilience there.
Yeah, we're a culture that forgets sometimes that people who live alone are bringing us gifts and ways of thinking that we wouldn't be thinking about if we didn't know them, right? So there's a piece of that living alone and being alone invites forward, I think, in communities, a kind of greater multiplicity of how we live, so that recognizing and honoring those who are alone is as important as recognizing those who have families or who come with different kinds of families. I think the challenge in our culture is that the church has always been good about recognizing some people who live alone, but we've not been good about figuring out how as a community to really care about one another in a kind of network of care that extends beyond the pastoral leader or beyond a few members of a congregation. Intentionally stepping out and intentionally connecting. Like, this is a moment, if I were a congregational pastor, I would want to make sure that my networks of care in a congregation were attending to all the people in our community and not just some. So that those who are quieter, or those who live alone, or those who are trying to figure out how to get the groceries because they have a child at home and they're trying to be a single parent, finding ways for the community to step in, for the community to surround at this time, seems to be one of the gifts that I think belongs to the church. We've done that in congregations for years, and yet it's also a challenge because we forget, we're busy, we're tired, we don't quite always know how to reach out. So this is also a great time for congregations to do some training around what it means to care and how we have conversations that are invitational and open, how we help create spaces for people, how we listen with intentionality and help people name what's going on in their spirits. I think that would be a real gift in a congregation at this point in time. Not just another thing to do, but really thinking about what is it that this congregation wants to embody as they care for those who are around them.
Got another one here that it's really talking about resilience, that how the word is being used. And I'm going to read part of this. Is that resilience lately, there's some discomfort related to that term by folks who perceive it as being used in institutional contexts as an individual capacity that institutions, organizations, and companies encourage their employees to develop in order to actually push through kind of what we're going through right now, when instead, perhaps what we should look at is changing, is maybe there's a change. Maybe we should have resistance to that concept and push for change. And then how do we, what's the thinking about that?
Yeah, it's kind of, that's such a great comment. It's almost as if resiliency is an armor that we ought to wear, and the oughtness of it, we should be resilient people, and we should change cultures by having individuals who are resilient. Is that kind of the sense of it?
Whether it's being, it's like, well, develop your resiliency so the institution does well.
Yes. So on the backs of the human beings who work in the institution,
exactly,
or who show up every day, they are now responsible also for, what do I want to say, buoying or holding up the institutional culture. So that, this is one of the, I think, and if we can, I kind of go back to Dr. Fauci again, if we could engender in this moment a real community understanding of who we are not just individuals who happen to be in communities. We are actually communities who nurture and help grow and challenge and help resist, help form and shape individuals. And it's not an either or, right? I am pretty clear that I have some pieces that are my own, and yet I know that I would not be who I am without a community or several communities over time who have shaped and formed and helped me think, and who have sometimes thought about things that I haven't thought about and who I deeply disagree with sometimes. That's a community. So I think one of my fears is that things like resiliency and compassion and courage take on this individualistic tone, that if we could all just do this individually, then we'd be okay as a collective, rather than saying resiliency in some ways comes to us through those stories of faith that those communities and congregations before us, who were here before we even were kind of thought about in some ways, that community nurtured and shaped a spirit, soul, resiliency. And it's not up to me just as an individual to bring my best. It's up to the community also to think about, how do we care for the people? How do we do healthcare in a way that cares for the whole of people and not just those who can afford it? How do we do childcare and recognize that what's at stake is not just a single parent and a child, but a whole community? That it's the community that nurtures a child with a parent and not a parent alone. So yeah, it's a really helpful comment, really helpful.
I have another question. How
Mm-hmm.
how can a relationship be drawn between resiliency and healing?
Say it again. How can
a relationship be drawn between resiliency and healing?
And healing. Thanks. Yeah, because sometimes, so resiliency doesn't mean I just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. Resiliency means, I think, that we also learn about sitting still, and we learn about quietness, and we learn about what it takes to heal, which sometimes is just really hard work and very slow work. This kind of relates in some ways to the way in which we've individualized resiliency, right? That somehow, if we're going to be resilient, we have to just keep doing. We have to just keep moving forward. When healing communities, healing people, just takes an incredible amount of being with, of quietness, of stillness, of rest, of the right kinds of medications, whatever they are. That healing is not about always doing. It is sometimes about being in spaces that are generative, that allow for us the kind of wisdom and the kind of people around us who will nurture and care for us and along with us. So that healing, while they're distinct, I think that genuine healing requires that we just not keep on keeping on, but sometimes that we sit and rest, that we sit and recuperate. That's a kind of significant way in which we, I think, heal. So they're related. Good healing takes some resilient spirit, and good resiliency can contribute to spirit of healing, but they're not the same, I think. Do we have time for one more?
I think so. Yeah.
All right, we have, what is at the end of our resiliency? Is it survival or is it change?
Yeah, or is it something different? So I wonder if it's because I read sometimes into the New Testament, I think sometimes about what it means to have a life abundantly. What's an abundant life look like? And it's not an individual life, it's a collective abundance. How do we so nurture resiliency in our cultures and our systems and people that we find ways to sit in the hard spots, face the difficult questions, make choices that are not always popular. And sometimes I think that moves us toward transformation. Sometimes that is transformation. I think the resiliency doesn't have a goal perhaps, but resiliency is a dynamic that helps us continue to thrive, to look for ways to thrive, to help communities thrive. So it's a great question. It's a really good question. I think we're just about to the end of our time. Some of you will, I want to honor the time. I think we set an hour. I'm gonna, Lauren, if you're there, if we can play that last piece of music. It's by Sweet Honey in the Rock, and feel free to stick around if you want to, and I will stay around and chat after the music is done, or if you need to go, feel free to do that. But thank you so much for showing up in life and for showing up here.
I think before we cue the music, and as people sign off, I just want to remind people that we will send out a link for everyone who registered. We'll send you out an email with a link to the recording in case you want to go back and revisit that. And also to a survey if you'll fill out to help us figure out how to do this better. And just to say, I'm very thankful that all of you were here this afternoon and appreciate your participation. If we didn't get to your question, I'm very sorry about that. There were a lot of good comments that came through. And I think we'll try to get from Joretta a list of her references of people that she mentioned, the books and such, that we can include in that email. Okay, thank you all.